Hello and welcome to today's event with Heath Brown, Associate Professor of Public Policy at John Jay College. He'll be talking about his new book, Homeschooling the Right, How Conservative Education Activism Erodes the State. I'm Whitney Sheridan, Director of Communications for the School of Public Policy in the College of the Liberal Arts at Penn State. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to quickly explain the format of our discussion. We will leave time for audience participation at the end of Professor Brown's talk, but please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box at any time throughout the presentation. And now I'm happy to introduce Chris Whitcow. He's the Associate Director for the School of Public Policy. Hi, Chris.
Hello, Whitney. Thanks for that introduction to the event. And I want to thank Heath for coming here to speak with us. And I want to thank everybody who's in the audience watching. And it's a real pleasure to introduce Heath today to talk about his new book, Homeschooling the Right. He has a PhD in public policy from GWU, George Washington University. He's on the faculty at John Jay College, where he teaches courses in public policy and public administration. Heath is a great provider of public goods for political science and public policy. He has hosted a podcast on new books, a co-authored podcast, and he's the mastermind, or at least one of the masterminds, of the highly influential Three Streams blog, which I hear Biden looks at every day when he gets up in the morning. That's the rumor anyway. He's written a bunch of articles and a few books on presidential transitions, how interest groups lobby during presidential transitions, money in politics. His book on the Tea Party is fascinating. You should check that out. But today we're going to hear about his new book, which is Homeschooling on the Right, about the homeschool movement. And this is an excellent book. I was looking through it today. But you don't have to take my word for it. I'm going to read you a couple of the quotes from scholars that the blurbs on the back. Suzanne Mettler, who you probably have heard of, one of our great policy scholars, calls it fascinating and informative. Frank Baumgartner calls it, quote, a model of policy history. I didn't know this, but there's about 2 million homeschool students in the US. There's actually more homeschool students in the US than there are private religious school students. So it's a big block of students, and as Heath will explain to you, the movement has incredible political and policy importance. So I'm really excited to hear about that today, and I'm going to turn it over to Heath.
Yeah, Chris, thank you. Let me just confirm that my screen is available.
We can see it. It's not full screen, but we can see the screen. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna do my best here. Thank you all for this chance to share my research. Thank you, Whitney, and thank you to Professor Richardson. I know who's involved in arranging this invitation to speak, and especially thank you to my friend and colleague Chris Whitcow. Thank you all for this chance. And let me just tell you a little bit about what I know about Chris, just to get us started. Not only is he a scholar in a public policy and inequality, he also will offer you absolutely excellent advice on home ownership, which no one who was attending this book talk today assumed you'd learn about. But I'm a recent homeowner, having been a long-time apartment dweller in Brooklyn, New York. And what I've learned is if you're not sure about like what type of lawnmower to buy, just ask Chris. and if you don't know how to use that lawnmower you just bought, Chris will tell you you should be using it weekly, except in the fall when you use it a little less often. And if you're not sure whether to install one of these trendy but very expensive underfloor heating, you've probably all heard about this. I'm new to this. Chris will recommend that you simply buy a nice pair of slippers because it's just too expensive. So send your questions to Professor Whitcow, all of the questions, including those about his important books about public policy and inequality. So thank you. So my name is Heath Brown, and as Whitney introduced briefly, I'm a associate professor at John Jay College and also the CUNY Graduate Center. And this photo here is one of the most famous from the West Virginia textbook war of 1974. And though my book is far from dirty, my talk today is about that policy conflict. Its historical significance for the conservative movement, something that I've written about before, but also its significance for the homeschooling movement, something I've written about for a book that was published just 2 weeks ago. Now, if I gave this talk 5 years ago, I think I'd have to spend a lot of time explaining just what homeschooling is. In the midst of this pandemic, I don't think that's quite as necessary right now. But 5 years ago, I also don't think the historical context of a certain wing of the homeschooling movement would be so important to talk about. It is a wing, a powerful section of homeschoolers that I focus on in the book and in this talk. But to be clear, there are homeschool parents of all types of ideologies, religions, and partisanship. There are also conservatives, many who send their children to public school or quite conventional private schools. I'm interested in the overlap here. The conservative wing of the homeschooling movement is the focus here of my talk. It is this group that has been most powerful, but they do not speak for every homeschool parent today, nor in the past. Nonetheless, in the book, I show that in 2016, 60% of self-identified homeschool parents voted for Donald Trump, the same percentage that voted for Mitt Romney four years earlier and voted for John McCain 4 years before that. That's a majority of homeschool families, but definitely not all. With that stated, let me begin some of the historical story that I'd like to tell today, and then talk a little bit more about kind of where we are today. This story starts in Kanawha County, West Virginia, the home of the state capital, Charleston, for those of you that haven't been, a county that long voted for Democrats, had a history of labor conflicts around mining, but by the early 1970s was changing. In the summer of 1974, as they had each previous year, a group of teachers and others in the district had approved a reading list. That year, in 1974, the list included several excerpts from civil rights leaders. One member of the school board, Alice Moore, was so incensed by these readings, which she viewed as profane and dirty. One of the books Moore was most angry about was Soul on Ice by Eldridge Cleaver. Now, worth noting, though there were critics in the district, the book was chosen, all of the books were chosen in the standard process by local teachers, and there were vocal supporters of including Soul on Ice and others, such as the section of the autobiography of Malcolm X. But to Moore, the decisions weren't simply a reflection of what local teachers wanted. They reflected a national movement that she was opposed to. This wasn't just about books she described as dirty. This was about federal control of the community, about what Moore believed was a loss of control to the bureaucracy in which she had no say. Fundamentally, this was about politics, and not surprisingly, it was also about racism and gender and religion and the family. Now, recall that though the Supreme Court had not yet ruled on segregation academies, the era of massive resistance just across the border in Virginia was just coming to an end, and the private school vouchers that had propped up segregated private schools had been outlawed in Virginia just a few years earlier. It is into this context of late Jim Crow policies that this conflict in West Virginia must be understood. Nevertheless, Moore's initial work to get signatures for a petition to block the books failed in the school board. And as the summer ended in 1974, the books would be used, leading to a critical decision by organizers of the protests. Moore and others encouraged families to keep their kids at home. Approximately 9,000 county students stayed home, 20% of the student body in county schools. Some were educated in private classes held in church basements, like the photo that you see. These informal schools, often operated by local church, provided a way for some parents to educate. This tactic foreshadowed what was to come, because other parents had kept their kids home for the early days of the fall term. Opting out of the public school foreshadowed a protest tactic that soon morphed into a policy strategy for conservatives. But as the fall progressed, opting out of the public schools was not the only thing going on. Alerted to the conflict by local activists, national level figures descended on Kanawha. Some of the leading figures in the post-Goldwater rise of the conservative movement and religious right arrived. Congressman Philip Crane, then the chair of the new but influential Republican Study Group, spread the word to a mailing list across the country, urging donations to support the protesters and warning of police brutality. The brand new Heritage Foundation, formed just a year earlier, was also eager to get involved. They dispatched a new education staffer named Connie Marshner, along with a lawyer named James McKenna. Marshner at the time had been busy canvassing the country, seeking out what she described as little clusters of evangelical and fundamentalist moms groups. And McKenna, who was an attorney, had been defending families who were homeschooling their kids in violation of local truancy and mandatory enrollment rules. This dynamic duo, Marshner and McKenna, likely saw in Kanawha a conflict that was ripe for this new politicized think tank to do some work to mobilize conservatives to action and crystallize the think tank's vision to more closely link ideology and policy. Now, not to be outdone, a somewhat older group, the John Birch Society, also visited West Virginia. A writer for the Bircher magazine wrote, "One has to go no further than Kanawha County, which spent $500,000 in a program in interethnic studies that would embarrass a self-respecting pygmy." This was the John Bircher Society interpretation of what was going on here in Kanawha County. One of the most prominent leaders of the protest was Reverend Marvin Horan, a local preacher who stirred up anger in riled crowds. Joining Horan and the protesters was the Klan. Horan gravitated to the Klan's involvement. You see him pictured here smiling in the midst of a protest, and also shown standing behind the KKK's, one of the KKK leaders at a rally in Charleston. The Klan saw what Heritage and the Birchers saw, an opportunity. But the opportunity was to use violence and mayhem to win concessions from the local school board. On October 9th of that fall, dynamite was thrown into an elementary school and another school was firebombed. 2 days later, protesters threw a Molotov cocktail into a school and dynamite exploded near the Board of Education office at the end of a meeting. Fortunately, nobody was hurt. The New York Times, reporting about this time period, described it as a season of marches, parades, rallies, scuffles, shootings, fistfights, and so forth. The nation's attention was drawn to what was going on in this county. At the center of this was Reverend Horan. He was later convicted of conspiracy for his involvement in the bombing of the elementary school. This was an organized and dangerous and violent period, and this violence happened at places of learning over the choice of textbooks for kids to learn from. Now, so far, the story I have to tell, I think makes it clear that the conservative movement, the nascent conservative movement and violent protests had something to do with each other. But what did they have to do with homeschooling? We come back to Alice Moore, the school board member that got this all started. Once a resolution was reached on the textbooks, Moore felt that it didn't mean anything. Importantly, as Moore was running for re-election, she surmised forebodingly that parents may now be forced to educate their children in their homes. Now, remember, at the time, homeschooling was largely illegal in West Virginia, as it was in much of the country. And while there's a long history in the country of education by tutors, at this point, universal public education was the norm, and attendance in either a public or a certified private school was the law. And the idea of educating at home as a type of resistance was really quite novel. This was a novel idea for Moore to put forward, but it had an audience in the state. Receptive to this vision was a man named Phil Suter. Suter was an elected state superintendent in charge of the county schools, and he pulled together a new advisory group in 1978 that got rid of Cleaver and Malcolm X, returning to something that resembled the pre-1974 curriculum. Suter later explained to the New York Times that he had, quote, been very sensitive to what the public's demands are. That is, the public demands of the protesters, of the supporters of Moore, and of their national allies like the Birchers, the Heritage Foundations, and even the Klan. But Suter wasn't done there. He left public office to lead the charge on legalizing homeschooling in the state. He formed several organizations that advocated for religious and parental freedom, echoing the cries of protesters in Kanawha. And he boldly pushed for what is called Exemption K. Exemption K would exempt students from compulsory attendance laws if state education requirements were met elsewhere. It didn't exactly legalize homeschooling, but this was the opening that advocates of homeschools needed. And many applied for status as a non-public school so as to qualify for an Exemption K. The policy of opting out was cemented in state law. It was cemented as a form of educational protest and is a model for a host of other policy protests on other issues. Writing at the time, Kevin Phillips, a central founder of the conservative movement, called Alice Moore a part of, quote, the New Right. Rick Perlstein called Kanawha the Mecca of the New Right. And Kanawha means so many things, so many different things historically. First, it encapsulated a new policy agenda fusing religious conservatives and anti-government libertarians. Second, it helped to reframe the fight against desegregation around parental and religious rights, a strategy to avoid confrontation on the grounds of civil rights. And third, it introduced the concept of opt-out politics as a tool to translate an ideological agenda into a governing agenda. In this way, homeschooling is just one example, but there are others, including the privatization of Social Security, opposition to LGBTQ rights, vaccinations, and voluntary environmental standards. This isn't the only example of this kind of politics. Now, by the end of the 1980s, homeschooling was legal in all 50 states, typically allowing parents to remove their children from schools to educate at home, with limited oversight by public education officials, including exemptions from many certification requirements to teach, required subjects, and standard assessment. And by the end of the next decade, enrollment had grown to nearly 1 million. As Chris mentioned earlier, today, though the numbers are hard right now to estimate, probably somewhere around 2 million students homeschooled. We can talk more about that later. In Pennsylvania, homeschooling has expanded quickly, shown here just the increase from 2014 to 2018, a 12% increase over this 4-year time period. Now, homeschooling grew in enrollment, but also became entrenched in local, state, and federal affairs through a blossoming civil society. Hundreds of organizations sprung up in small towns and in suburbs and state capitals. Many of those groups simply providing the basics of how to homeschool, such as recommendations on reading material and mentoring of new teachers and even after school options. But these groups didn't just provide pedagogical help. Some coalesced into powerful advocacy organizations. One education staffer said to a reporter recently about the homeschool advocates that they confronted that they had never seen a lobby more powerful and scary. The most powerful group was and remains the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, HSLDA. The longtime head of HSLDA, a man named Michael Farris, once said, "We will know that our homeschooling has been successful when we see real life victories from our children." He said, "We believe that someday homeschooled young people will help reverse Roe v. Wade, stop same-sex marriage, and help reestablish a strong view of the freedoms established by our founding fathers." And this expansive view of homeschooling is critical to understanding its importance. The leaders of the conservative homeschooling movement have never viewed this as solely about education. Homeschooling was a tool, a policy that could trigger other effects, what scholars call policy feedback. This all depended on homeschooling organizations constantly mobilizing parents and children, never accepting compromise, and always fighting for more exemptions and exceptions, more freedom from public rules and accountability, and an underlying disdain for government that has put this movement at odds with other competing visions for democracy. National organizations have spread this message and encouraged homeschool families to view themselves as a group. And it is this identity that has contributed to the influence of homeschoolers that far reaches beyond their numbers and their relatively limited financial resources. Now, there are plenty of examples of this, including George W. Bush crediting homeschool organizations for helping him get elected in 2000. But Mike Huckabee's Iowa caucus win in 2008 is especially telling. Here's a story in the New York Times from that campaign, just before he was able to win that Iowa caucus. And it quotes Michael Farris, the leader of the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. And he describes at the time the way homeschool families in Iowa who supported Huckabee didn't just vote for him. They also, he says, were making this campaign into one giant homeschool field trip. Now, Huckabee didn't win the nomination in 2008, but he and his daughter remain politically active through today. Now, here's Huckabee just 8 years later, in 2016, providing such a telling example of how the political, religious, and even commercial dimensions of homeschooling collide. In a single post on Facebook, Huckabee endorses Trump's victory, links Trump to the causes of homeschooling, patriotism, and of religious liberty, and then, in a very Huckabee kind of way, offers a first book free deal from the homeschooling textbook company that he's recently launched. Now, needless to say, only the first DVD is free. The real deal costs about $16 and $6 a month for a magazine subscription. Though not the focus of my talk today, the lucrative homeschooling textbook market is an important part of this story, and one that I think will only grow more important as states have made it easier for localities to subsidize the cost of homeschooling, something that has never been possible really in the past. And Huckabee wasn't alone in recognizing the potential of homeschoolers as a political group. Earlier in 2016, as Hillary Clinton was mobilizing 65 million voters, Grover Norquist pointed to homeschoolers as a voting bloc ripe for Donald Trump to court. He also included vapers and Uber drivers as a part of this libertarian coalition. Now, 40 years after Kanawha County, so many of these same themes and policies and conflicts remain. Now, homeschooling was not on the agenda in 1974, but it remains to this day an incredibly important part of the rise of the conservative movement. What I argue in the book is it is a rare case of sustained policy wins for conservatives. No homeschooling policy ever really goes back to where it had been, unlike other areas that conservatives have fought for. Now, though there are many non-conservative and non-Republican homeschool parents, it's the conservative homeschool community that remains eager to help elect conservative candidates up and down the ballot. Now, my book was written before the pandemic, And 2020 and into 2021 has ravaged really every aspect of our lives, and schooling is one of the most hard hit. And over the last year, homeschooling in one form or another has mushroomed in many states. 1 year ago, I imagine half of you wouldn't have known anyone who was involved in homeschooling. Today, I'd be surprised if anyone here today doesn't have a firsthand experience with homeschooling, either as a student, as a parent, or as a family member. Homeschooling has also grown more diverse over time. It was once primarily white, upper middle class families and dominated by Christian conservatives who homeschooled. Today, this is changing. There's a rising number of Black and Latino homeschool families, and homeschooling has proven attractive to other religious groups as well. And technology has also changed homeschooling. Once homeschooling relied strongly on two-parent homes where one parent, typically the mother, served as the teacher, instructional designer, and school volunteer and coach. Today, technology allows much more curriculum to be used in homeschools, now often for a price. And public schools are increasingly willing to allow homeschooling students to participate in athletics and even some classes, things they hadn't really done in the past. So I return here at the end to this Venn diagram, and what is unclear about the future of homeschooling policy is whether the influx of new homeschoolers this year will shift homeschooling to the center, moderate some of the extreme approaches to homeschooling, and depoliticize its advocacy. Or will those compelled to homeschooling by the pandemic come to accept homeschooling as a preferred form of education, preferred to public schools, driving a larger wedge between public education and other alternatives? The consequences for democracy of this is truly worrisome, and something I'd welcome a discussion of in the question and answer session is exactly this longer term consequence of these trends. But knowing our time and the Zoom attention span is limited, let me end there and thank everyone for attending and welcome comments, questions, criticisms, and also experiences homeschooling. I hope that if there are those that are in the midst of homeschooling in one fashion or another and have an experience to share, I would be eager to hear it. So thank you everyone for all of your time.
Thanks so much, Heath. We're excited to hear from all of our participants now. We're opening up time for your questions. And I think in the meantime, Chris Whitcow has some questions that he has prepared. So Chris, if you take it away now.
Yeah, thanks for that, Heath. That's really interesting. And I do appreciate you being cognizant of the Zoom attention spans. But one thing I want to hear more about, which you did get into in the book, but you didn't get into as much in this talk, is the policy influence of the homeschooling movement. Can you talk about what they've been able to accomplish, and also just how the success of the homeschooling movement kind of fits in with our broader understandings of why some interest groups are able to influence policy and that sort of thing? Because, you know, we tend to think of interests with a lot of money and lobbying, you know, paid lobbyists and things like that being more influential. So if you can get into kind of what have the policy accomplishments been, and then why has this group been able to achieve those accomplishments?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the aspects of the book that I didn't talk about was a contrast that I try to build up through the book, and that is the contrast between homeschooling and charter schooling. And from a certain vantage point, the two are not distinguished. And typically, if you see a presidential candidate talk about education, like Donald Trump, they will rattle off a list of things they support, an undifferentiated list, ranging from homeschooling to vouchers to charter schooling, as if they all fit into some undifferentiated version of school choice. And this is actually School Choice Week that we're celebrating this week, but they're different. And part of the argument that I make in the book is that the differences between these policies have a big consequence for the subsequent politics and policy change. And what I mean by that is the design of homeschooling policy, though it appears to give the same kind of choice that charter school policy does, in fact, the choice is really quite different. When you as a parent decide to homeschool your children, you receive almost nothing in return. You receive no free textbooks. You don't get access to the library at the local school. You may have the local public library, but not at the school. Your children in the past were cut off from participating in school sports. And what this has meant is a very different design than charter schooling. If you're a parent who decides to send your child to a charter school, most of what comes to you remains. Your education at the charter school is still free. Public tax money still pays for it. And as a consequence of this different design, homeschooling has almost never had an organized and effective opponent, whereas charter schooling has had an active and vocal set of opponents that range, sort of most famously teachers' unions, but that aren't the other ones, in part because charter schooling design takes money and resources away from other schools and moves it to the new charter schools. Homeschooling doesn't do that. And so there over time have been very few opponents of homeschooling policy, organized, effective opponents. So that if we look at the change in homeschooling policy on a state-to-state basis and compare that to the change in charter school policy, homeschooling policy has never looked back. There's almost no example of a state's homeschooling law becoming more restrictive. Almost no example of a state making it more difficult to homeschool or limiting homeschool really in any way. Whereas charter schooling, and Pennsylvania is a very good example of this, has had movement back and forth. And over time, charter school laws have become more restrictive and then less restrictive. And states and localities have made it harder to open a charter school, and they've restricted the number of charter schools. And that's all been the result of the opposition to charter schooling that is absent from homeschooling. And that's one of the biggest differences here. And I think the reason is because the design of the policies creates opposition on the one side, but almost none for homeschooling. So they face very little opposition. And what has then happened over time is that homeschooling advocates, having won victory after victory after victory, have tended to stretch their interests into other non-educational issues. Whereas charter school advocates rarely stray from their central purpose to advocate for charter schools. And so we get national organizations like the HSLDA, one of the most powerful interest groups in this homeschooling world, taking on homeschooling directly, but also straying into other issues on occasion, like Michael Farris mentioned, same-sex marriage, truancy laws. They have offered advice on the Second Amendment and gun rights and gun ownership, and tried to link all of these things together so that to be a part of the homeschooling movement, that is the conservative part of the homeschooling movement, is not to be a single issue group, but it's actually a multi-issue group. And that has big consequences for the politics that have dominated these two apparently similar, but really quite distinct policy domains. And part of the book tries to show this empirically.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Heath. We have some other questions that kind of tap into that question that I just asked. So let me follow up with some other people's questions. We have a question from a local school board member, actually. And she was asking about the connections between the homeschooling movement and the charter movement. So at a, I guess, tactical level, do they work together to basically achieve common goals to essentially, well, let me just read, influence policies that move our country away from broad support for public schools? And we thank you for that question.
Yeah, that's a terrific question. And it was one of the sort of working hypotheses that I had going into the book, which was to try to tell some of the sort of political history of these two movements. And I went in with the assumption that there must be some overlap in who was advocating early on the initial round of homeschooling policies. And there must have been a close association between those people and those that were advocating for charter schooling, thinking that they must have been happening at about the same time. In fact, they're really quite distinct. Homeschooling policies, by and large, were adopted in the 1980s. Charter school policies really didn't emerge until the 1990s. So they're separated in some ways by time. Where these movements were starting also really differed. Charter schooling, especially in its earliest days, was very much an urban, advocated in urban areas, and that's where the policies really took off, not so much for homeschooling. And so in many ways, the two have remained quite distinct from each other. What you see over time, and I think you see over the last 5 years or so, is the two, especially among conservatives, becoming much more closely tied together. And one of the reasons for this, I think, is that for some time period, the two parties were essentially on the same page in terms of charter schooling policy. It was hard across the 1990s and much of the 2000s to differentiate whether Republicans or Democrats, where they differed on charter schooling. And at the margin, there may have been differences, but in broad strokes, both parties were largely supportive of charter schools. Not so much today. And the opposition within the Democratic movement, not just at the margin, but in pretty major ways, opposition to charter schooling is a phenomenon that is not what has happened for much of the history of the charter school movement. And so we see that, so that partisan effect within charter schooling, Democrats have never had very much interest, have never talked that much about homeschooling. If you look at national conventions, charter schooling emerges on both the Republican and also Democratic convention early in the 1980s and continues. Homeschooling shows up for Republicans in the late 1980s and continues today, and has never been an issue that Democrats at the national level have addressed with any enthusiasm. And I think that's in part because the opposition to homeschooling has been largely absent, whereas within the charter schooling world, it has been prone to great conflict. And so historically, the two have been quite distinct. I suspect, especially if some of the policy changes that we've seen over the last year take hold, we're going to see a much closer association. And the reason for that is that many state governments are moving to make the costs of homeschooling either subsidized or a tax write-off for homeschooling families. And this had never been the case in the past. Homeschooling advocates never pushed for this. They always thought that this was an invitation for more regulation. They never wanted it. But this year we've seen a change, and part of this was initiated by the outgoing Secretary of Education, who was a big proponent of homeschooling. But I think as we see more resources come directly to homeschoolers, we're going to see more conflict, ironically, and also more closer ties between the advocates for homeschooling and the advocates for charter schooling. This is something I would anticipate for the future. Terrific question.
Okay. Here's a question from Lillard Richardson, our director of the School of Public Policy. How is the homeschooling movement different in its tactics and strategies than other social movements of the past few decades?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for the invitation to be here today. I think that one of the things that has been misleading about homeschooling and the homeschooling movement is that the apparent opt-out has meant dropout, which is to say that taking children out of the public school has meant sort of moving out of sort of the political conversation. And the exact opposite has been the case. That if you go back and you read the homeschooling magazines from the 1980s and 90s, what national organizations consistently communicated to families was that they should view themselves and view their identity as homeschooled families. And that identity meant that they should be more vocal, not less, that they should be participants in the policy process, not bystanders. And I think it's this formation of an identity, especially for those that were conservative, both religiously and also politically, that coalesced into a strong, powerful group that were very easy to mobilize. And so we see organizations like HSLDA really at the forefront of using phone banking, using letter writing, and there's all sorts of kind of war stories about a member of Congress introducing a bill that barely even peripherally touched on homeschooling. You wouldn't even think that this is something that was intended to regulate homeschooling. But national advocates thought that it just stepped too close, and their offices would be flooded with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of phone calls. And the legacy of that is an aversion by any elected official to even approach homeschooling in any kind of way. And I think that sort of total advocacy effort by members distributed geographically across the country, especially in parts of the country that may not have as active civil societies in other areas. And so in a typical rural community, the public library may have been closed, and a post office may have been closed, and a hospital branch may have been closed, but you can find 5, 6, 7 local homeschooling organizations. These are organizations providing services to people, but also a real voice. And so in many ways, I think they've served as a model for other grassroots advocacy organizations, including, I argue in the book, the Tea Party. And there are numerous Tea Party leaders at the national and also local level who had a background either in homeschooling or in running a homeschool organization. And I argue that it has been this training ground for conservative activists who went on to then form Tea Party organizations and participate in politics in a much more visible way, but only because they had been given these opportunities to practice these strategies were they able to later run for office or operate a Tea Party group and so forth. And so there are these effects that I think we see, and I think we see them today in much of the rhetoric of the conservative movement that have strong echoes of a certain wing of the homeschooling movement.
Okay, thank you. Another question we have is when you have your Venn diagram, the homeschoolers, the conservatives, and that overlap, is that overlap growing or what? It sounds like maybe it's changing a little bit because of the unique circumstances we find ourselves in, but is the movement becoming more conservative, or how's that changing over time?
Yeah, I think, the question is sort of in percentage or in overall terms. That Venn diagram is growing. And today, there isn't a person in the country, from the US Department of Education to the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, that can tell you how many students are being homeschooled right now. We don't know. We don't know in part because the process of homeschooling varies a great deal. What it means to homeschool in one state differs from another state. And so the counting is really, really hard. And an irony of the book is that the counting is very hard, and that counting is hard by design. It is by design that homeschool policies make it difficult to count up the number of families that are homeschooled. It makes it difficult for us to know the typical qualifications of a parent who is homeschooling their children. In Michigan, for example, they basically make it impossible to know how many students are homeschooled across the state. So we don't know. But to the essence of your question, I think that what we see is that in percentage terms, homeschooling is growing less conservative, but growing overall. I think that what we've seen, not just over the last year, but over the last number of years, is that technology and also some other factors have afforded the opportunity to homeschool to a larger group of people whose motivations haven't been the same as the very earliest group of homeschoolers. And so they still have an interest in opting out of what's being offered at the public school, but it might not be for religious reasons, as many of the earliest generation of homeschoolers were motivated by. And so I think that what we would get is a greater diversity of ideological views within the population of homeschool parents, but also I think less extreme ideology. I think there had been a period where homeschooling was something that was pursued as a very purposeful decision that was very much based in the identity of a family, connected to things like religion and values and perceptions of what was going on in the public school, and even race, and even ideas about who a family believed their children should be in class with. I think today that's much less the case, and the ideologies of the homeschooling movement are becoming less pronounced than in the past.
Okay, you mentioned race briefly in your last answer, and we do have a question about race. And this was something I was really wondering, because if you look at the literature on school choice, which I know you know very well, one of the big findings is that parents will tell people a lot of things about why they want to choose a school, but for white parents, a lot of times it has to do with race. They want to avoid diverse schools, or schools with a lot of minorities, essentially. And the question is, any thoughts about why some of the processes you describe match up with the end of the Great Society era? So this movement, grew up around the time when these school desegregation issues were really big in a lot of parts of the country. Can you talk more about that? Like, how much was it just of course, race and these other ideologies are bound together, but can you just talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, they're bound up, and when national surveys have asked people for their reasoning, they aren't asked, and they don't explain it in terms of race. But the most popular reasons that are given overlap with some of the reasons people would give and not say. That it's the diversity of a school, it's a changing demographics of a community. People would describe their issue of school violence as something that motivated them to choose to homeschool, that the values of the school didn't align with their own. The rise of the homeschooling movement happened at the same time that some of the other alternatives, including the rise of segregation academies, were ruled illegal. And so what we have is an alternative that is consistent with all sorts of motivations to opt out. And one of the most prominent motivations to opt out is a discomfort with a changing society, a society that is changing, and that those changes are reflected in a curriculum like in Kanawha, that reflected a broader array of voices than in the past. And homeschooling, opting out of those schools, like the families did in Kanawha County, was a way to, for some families, to resegregate their home life and to remove themselves from community public schools that were perhaps changing and becoming more diverse in ways that they were uncomfortable with. It's very hard to study this empirically because we have very limited data on where students are coming from, where they reside. And so the empirical case that homeschooling has reflected a form of resegregation is not a case that I make in the book. It's not a case I've really seen anyone make. And it's in part because the data are just so hard to find on this. But I think there are countless examples of overlaps between other issues where race and racism have been prominent, and school choice is one of them. Other issues related to prayer in school have been prominent. Prayer in school and the elimination of prayer in school has been a was listed as a motivator for some families, and I think continues to this day to be an area where religious and there's all sorts of Christian nationalism that shows up in some parts of the conservative homeschool movement, not the entirety, but there are some curriculum that are devoted to a very different vision for society than you would get in your typical public school curriculum.
Okay, thanks. I got a question here from one of our MPP students, our astute MPP student. In your opinion, does homeschooling itself push parents and students toward conservative beliefs?
Yeah, and who was that student?
This is Hannah Lyons. So she's asking about the chicken and egg here, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely, Hannah, and thank you very much for that. One of the ways that I studied this is to see the messages that were shared by the most prominent interest groups representing homeschool families. And what I wanted to do was to compare those messages with what you would imagine could be very similar messages coming from the most prominent charter school organizations. From a distance, you would say they would basically follow the same kind of broad stroke script, something sort of vaguely focused on choice. And you might argue, use a similar kind of messaging. What I found was something very different from that. Despite the fact that they would both be called school choice issues, homeschooling advocates focus primarily on freedom and educational liberty. And charter school advocates focus much more on things like the market and efficiency. You rarely hear homeschooling advocates talking about things like the public market or the private market and the workings of the private market. Really hear them talking about the efficiencies or inefficiencies of education, like you do for charter school families. And as a consequence of this, I believe, and it's very hard to tell because we haven't done experiments on this, which would be also interesting, but very hard to do. What I suspect is that this has reinforced for families who have opted into homeschooling and who get the magazines and today subscribe to the digital information that comes, is they get a pretty consistent message about issues of liberty and issues of freedom. And those messages that come from homeschool organizations are also, as I mentioned earlier, tied into other political issues, other policy concerns of conservatives. You don't see that from charter school advocates. Charter school advocates don't mention other social policies. They stick very tightly to a script focused on efficiency. Neither group ever mentions issues of educational equity. Let me just say that. That's never something that they communicate with their members. And so what I suspect is that has an effect on families. And that effect in sort of theoretical terms is what we call policy feedback. And we don't know how powerful that effect is on families. But what we do know is that the organizations that are sharing this information also around elections ask for volunteers. And they have been incredibly effective at getting parents and students to go out and volunteer on campaigns. Huge numbers, as in percentage terms of homeschooling families, turn campaigns into as Michael Farris mentioned, a small civics project. And there are curriculum based around campaigns. There was a famous sort of a campaign curriculum based around George Bush's election that awarded students points for all of the things they do, including things like going out and volunteering at the Republican office in their community. They got like 200 points for that, and they would get different amounts of points for different things they were doing. These were partisan. It wasn't simply go and register voters. It was partisan activities. And I think that's something that is an evidence of the effect on some families, not most, but of some families. We don't see that in other areas that might seem very similar. And I think it's because of the intensity of the experience of homeschooling and how sort of overwhelming, if Hannah, if you or if anyone knows of somebody who's been homeschooled, it's a very different experience in terms of the relationship to curriculum and material and other students. And I think that intensity means the information that's shared has a bigger effect than in other areas. And so maybe a little bit of an answer to a great question. Experiments on this would be fascinating, just are very, very difficult to do.
Mhm. All right, thanks for that. We have another excellent question from Amanda Snyder, also one of our excellent students here in the MPP program. And her question is, I'll just kind of boil it down, but what is there in terms of holding parents accountable for educational outcomes? So that's been another big movement of the last 20, 30 years, is accountability in education, more standardized testing, meeting requirements and that sort of thing. How does that fit in with this homeschooling? Are parents being held accountable for student performance and so forth?
It varies, but in most states, it's very limited. In most states, for example, in order to serve as a homeschool teacher, you don't need certification. You don't need a college degree. In some states, you don't even need a high school diploma. What that means is the low level of educational, or the entry level of educational accountability, which is the accountability that every teacher in the classroom will have a certain level of competency over their material, is largely absent from homeschools, which doesn't mean that homeschool teachers aren't doing an excellent job with what they're doing. It's just that there's no requirement that you know anything about algebra or teaching of Spanish in order to serve as a homeschool teacher. Now that varies somewhat, and some states have stricter rules. Pennsylvania has one of the tighter homeschool regimes in the country. But even still, compared to even a private school or a charter school, the rules are lax and the exemptions are numerous. In some states, students are required to abide by some of the educational assessment rules, but rarely are students required to take the standardized tests that public school students are required to take. In some states, there are portfolio that have to be completed and then evaluated by an outside person who's going to then make some judgments. In some states, there are reports that have to be sent into a county or a state, but in those same states, it's rarely specified what the consequence of, and who even reads those final reports. So the accountability is as decentralized as you can imagine, on purpose. And so for homeschooling advocates, part of the motivation often of homeschooling is to move away from a standardized form of education that is dominated by testing. It's to move away from the kinds of rules and regulations that govern who can, who cannot teach. And so this is a feature of homeschooling policy for those that believe it's a valuable way to educate students, not a bug. And for this reason, there have been some studies of homeschooling outcomes that suggest a typical homeschool student really does no better or worse in terms of college attendance or civic participation and things that we might wonder about. Those studies tend not to be very comprehensive. They tend not to be done by the kinds of independent sources that we would use to make judgments about charter schools or public schools and make decisions on whether a public school is going to be reconstituted or a principal fired or what have you. And so this is an extreme version of self-regulation. This is an extreme version of opting out of all of the kinds of rules and regulations that we assume for your typical public school. And that's very much by design.
Okay, thanks for that. There's a few other questions. I think we are probably going to wrap up because we're right at 3 o'clock right now. So for those of you who didn't get your question answered, we apologize for that. I know some of them, I can tell you, are actually answered in the book for sure.
There we go.
So go buy the book.
For sale now.
So get the book.
available at your local online mega retailer and probably Columbia University Press.
Which has an excerpt of the book. So if for
Yes.
some reason you decide you don't want to buy the book yet, you can read the first 50 pages or so at their website.
But buy the book. So anyway, thank you so much, Heath, for coming. We really appreciate it. It really is a fascinating book, and I think it's going to spur a lot of research.
Thank you.
Definitely, definitely. So thank you so much to Heath Brown, Associate Professor of Public Policy at John Jay College, for speaking with us today. And thank you for all of your great questions. We will post a replay of this event on our website and on our YouTube channel. You can access a link to our YouTube channel on our website, publicpolicy.psu.edu. I'm Whitney Sheridan, along with Chris Whitcow from the School of Public Policy. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.
Thank you all.
Thank you.